So as part of this unit on exploring kind of the linkages between power and inequality and this thing called disciplinary regimes, when we're talking about this within the context of intercultural communication, I think it's also really important to really kind of have a concept of what do we even mean by the concept of nation. We've explored this more a bit with the concept of nation states, but I really kind of want to take the state out of it for a second and really focus on this concept of nation. And so we're going to be focusing on the work of one person in particular, and this is Benedict Anderson. And Benedict Anderson was an Irish scholar of international studies and Asian studies, and in 1983 he wrote a book kind of asking these central questions. The first one was, what exactly is a nation? And when you hear the word nation, what do we mean by that? He also asked himself why the academic community was kind of struggling so much in defining what a nation means. And this was really kind of a really important question to him. The term nation is often taken as kind of a given, but when you really think about it and when you look at scholarship on it, academics really had a hard time defining this term. And he also wanted to know, if it's so hard to define and if it's so hard to really kind of see as this really real, tangible thing, how do people come to identify it with it? How do people come to identify as being of a particular nation? How does that happen, and why does it happen? And even more importantly than that, and this final question was what really got him to study this topic further, is why is it that national identity is so strong that people are willing to kill and die for it? And so his questions came from not just this idea that we have a national identity, but we can become so strongly attached to our national identity that we'll actually cause harm to others and to ourselves in order to protect it. And it's really kind of funny to think about that when you think about that in tandem with the idea that the concept of nation is actually very hard to define. And so Benedict Anderson wanted to write a book that would attempt to actually define nation. And in his book, Imagined Communities, he kind of gave this definition, is that nations are social constructs. We've learned about social constructs before and the ways in which we attach meaning to our social interactions and how things like race, gender, and class are social constructs. Well, Benedict Anderson argued, and many others that followed him also argued, that nations themselves are also social constructs. And what they are is that they're imagined, he called them imagined political communities, that are imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Imagined political communities. And this imagined communities and this definition of nation kind of had these central elements. One being that it's imagined, right? And that is kind of the most important part of imagined communities. It's not a real tangible thing. It's something that's very much constructed, and it's something that kind of exists in our psyche, but doesn't necessarily have this real tangible thing that we can identify as nation. It's imagined as limited, imagined as sovereign. It's imagined as community. I'm going to go through each one of these and really kind of explore what he meant by each of these. So the first component of his concept of imagined communities was that it was in fact imagined. And what he meant by this is that most members of a nation will never actually know each other, but yet they have this concept of belonging to a similar nation, right? So one example might be like in this photo of Paris, France, right? Someone from Paris, France might identify as being a Parisian, right? And really kind of have this strong kind of affinity in this national identity with being from France and maybe even with Paris in particular. But they're not going to know everyone who lives in Paris, and they're certainly not going to know everyone who lives in France. But there's a certain idea that they share some sort of level of community with them. And that kind of sense is an imagined sense, especially since they're not going to have any real kind of physical face-to-face contact with most members of France. The second part of imagined communities is this idea that it's imagined as limited. And what he meant by that is that every nation, no matter how large, whether we're talking about a small village somewhere in a kind of remote village, or whether we're talking about like a large expansive strip of land like China, right? That no matter where, no matter how big or small it is still finite. It has a sense of boundaries. It has a sense of borders. And what that sense of borders does, and we've talked about this when we've talked about nation states in the past, is that that sense of borders creates finite lines of who can say that they belong to that nation if they exist within those borders. And that's what Benedict Anderson meant by it is imagined as limited. And he also argued that it's imagined as sovereign. And what he meant by this there, and we've talked about this before as well, is that separation of church and state, that it's imagined as a centralized, independent government. Like modernism, this came out of the Age of Enlightenment, and it came out of this need for many people to really kind of undo this kind of linkage between the church and governance, and really kind of wanting to see a separation of that. And so this kind of concept of nation also derives from this need to separate from the church at a state level. And then finally, nations are imagined as community. And what he meant by that is that nations are imagined as comradeship, that it's this sort of kind of relationship that people have with the individual members of their nation, even though, as we said earlier, they will never actually meet most of those people. And why this becomes very important is not just because you have this you seem to share this connection with people that you will never meet, but is that concept of community also ignores very real inequalities and exploitation that happens amongst members of that community, of that nation. So it's really sort of this idealistic idea of community without fully acknowledging the ways in which people have very different experiences within that community. So an example would be a lot of that when we've talked about citizenship in the past and this concept of second-class citizenship. That would be an example of how imagined community really doesn't take into account the ways in which citizens might have very different relationships to citizenship and might not have the full rights of citizenship even though they were born here. And so Benedict Anderson also wanted to explore where this kind of feeling of national consciousness comes from. And he actually credited this with the development of the printing press, which he said accomplished something very specific. So the printing press, which made writing more accessible to the public, right? You no longer had to handwrite text. You could print, mass produce like books and distribute them, right? Is that it made written language more accessible to a wider range of people. It was a really important technological innovation. What it also did is it helped for governments to formalize language. So if you needed specific documents, for example, that you needed access to maybe for your property or for any other purpose, you could now access that. But what also happened with that is that you also had to really kind of develop a more formalized relationship to your language in order to access those documents. Because what these states did was they developed these really kind of formalized versions of a language. And so everyone kind of had to readjust to that. And so what you have then is language becoming less diverse. And that's really important when we're talking about the development of nations and this concept of nation. It really starts with language, and language becoming less diverse as a result of this formalization after the development of the printing press. So instead of Frenches, you now have French. Instead of Englishes or Spanishes, there's a English and a French. It becomes less diverse. And that loss of diversity is really important. It's very kind of closely tied to how nation and nationalism becomes linked to imperialism, because it imposes ways of knowing. So the thing with loss of diversity and that denial of difference is it strips different, say, cultures of those things that make them unique. So say, for example, that the photos that you have here are 3 popular foods that you can find pretty readily in the city of New Orleans, where I used to live. The one on the left is of a muffaletta, which is developed, the first one was developed in New Orleans at Central Grocery by an Italian family who owned that store. The middle is of a po' boy, which is French bread, some form of meat, fried shrimp, like in this picture here, is a popular combination. And then the one on the right, New Orleans, because of mass migration, has a large Vietnamese community, and so you'll also often find a lot of banh mi, which is a Vietnamese French bread with different meat and vegetables and fillings. Right. So each of these foods have different cultural heritages. Muffaletta coming from Italian immigrants, banh mi coming from Vietnamese immigrants, and po' boys coming from working class New Orleanians who used to, the original was actually French fries and gravy inside of French bread, and it was called po' boys for poor boy because they couldn't afford actual meat to put in their sandwiches during their lunch breaks. So these are very different foods with very different histories and very different cultural significance. Excuse me. And what something like development of a national consciousness would do, it was to take these 3 things and just call them all sandwiches. And while it's true that they're both bread with filling inside and they have that in common, those different histories and those different ingredients and the significance of those are very important. And it's important not to strip different cultures of their differences. But in the development of a national consciousness, that stripping of the diversity, that stripping of the difference is actually very important. And it's kind of a hallmark of imperialist projects, which is why nationalism and, say, for example, imposing French culture or British culture on Africa or Asia became so prominent. It's that stripping of diversity and trying to make them more like us. And that's a really kind of important concept of a really important part of the concept of nation. So to bring this back to nation state and intercultural praxis, how you can understand nation state is how the state, civil society, imagined communities, and the hegemony and stratification that runs through all 3 kind of converge to create this concept of nation state. It's the state and civil society and the kind of inequality that come with all, tied with this concept of nation, that there is in fact a nation, that it is this tangible thing, and the kind of loss of diversity that happens with that. And that's really important because it has a really profound impacts on our positioning, on our frames, and how we interact with each other, how we engage in dialogue with each other, especially if we're unaware of the effects that these have on us. So what we're going to be exploring in your textbook in particular is how the concept of nation state and these kind of 3 elements of nation state really influence our communication styles. Please let me know if you have any questions about this content. Thank you.